From a distance, the Tuscan countryside feels timeless. Rolling hills, cypress trees, narrow dirt roads winding past vineyards and olive groves. For decades, couples came here for privacy, romance, and quiet. No one imagined these peaceful landscapes would become the setting for Italy's most disturbing unsolved mystery. For nearly 2 decades, someone moved silently through these hills. Patient, methodical, invisible. Investigators would later realize they weren't dealing with chance, they were dealing with intent, and that realization came far too late. The first known case dates back to late summer of 1968. At the time, no one thought they were witnessing the beginning of a pattern. It looked like an isolated tragedy, a terrible but contained event, nothing more. This assumption would haunt Italian investigators for years. From a psychological perspective, this case teaches us how dangerous early misclassification can be. When events are treated as unrelated, patterns remain hidden. And when patterns remain hidden, prevention becomes impossible. The area surrounding Florence was not considered dangerous. Crime rates were low, communities were close-knit. People trusted the land and the people living on it. Couples parked along secluded paths without fear. Parents never warned their children to avoid the countryside at night. That sense of safety mattered, because the individual responsible depended on it. The first double death involved a young couple sitting inside a parked car. The scene suggested intimacy, privacy, and familiarity with the location. Nothing appeared random. Investigators initially focused on personal motives, jealousy, domestic conflict, crimes of passion. At the time, this made sense. But here's what investigators didn't know yet. The weapon used would become the most important detail of the entire case. A small caliber firearm. Quiet, easy to control, consistent. That detail would resurface again and again and again. Over the years, similar cases began to appear across rural areas near Florence. Always couples, always parked cars, always secluded spots known mostly to locals. The attacks followed a ritualistic pattern that investigators would only recognize much later. This case teaches us something crucial about human behavior. Serial offenders rarely start loud. They start small. They test boundaries. They observe reactions. They adapt. And that's exactly what happened here. By the early 1970s, whispers began circulating. Locals noticed similarities. Journalists began asking questions. Police quietly reviewed old files. But publicly, there was no acknowledgement of a larger threat. Why? What happened next would divide experts, families, and investigators, and turn this case into one of the most contested mysteries in modern criminal history. By the early 1980s, the pattern could no longer be ignored. What once looked like unrelated tragedies now formed a disturbing sequence. Investigators finally acknowledged they were dealing with a serial offender operating across the Tuscan countryside. This admission changed everything. Task forces were expanded. Jurisdictions that rarely cooperated were forced to share information. Old evidence was re-examined with fresh eyes, and the pressure to stop the attacks intensified. But there was a problem. Much of the early damage had already been done. From an investigative standpoint, delayed recognition creates cascading failures. Witnesses forget details, physical evidence degrades, scenes lose integrity. In this case, those weaknesses would become permanent obstacles. The attacks followed a consistent structure. Couples arrived at secluded locations, usually late in the evening, often places known for privacy rather than traffic. These were not random pull-offs. They were familiar spots. From a psychological perspective, that familiarity mattered. It suggested the person responsible knew the area intimately, possibly grew up there, possibly returned often. The approach was quiet, no warning, no confrontation. This wasn't about rage in the moment. It was about control from the first second. Ballistics experts confirmed something chilling. The same small caliber firearm had been used repeatedly, across years, across locations. That alone ruled out coincidence. Yet the weapon was never recovered. Investigators searched homes, questioned hunters, traced firearm registrations. Nothing surfaced. The absence of the weapon became as important as its presence. Meanwhile, public fear reached a boiling point. Newspapers printed maps showing danger zones. Couples avoided countryside roads at night. Parents warned their children in ways they never had before. The landscape itself felt different. What once symbolized romance now symbolized risk. This behavioral shift is important. Serial offenders often adapt when public awareness rises. They pause, they relocate, or they escalate. In this case, the pauses were long, months, sometimes years. Experts later noted that these gaps suggested a person capable of restraint, someone who could delay gratification, someone who did not act compulsively. That distinction matters. Compulsive offenders make mistakes quickly. Controlled offenders survive longer. As police interviews expanded, investigators began focusing on local men with violent histories, prior offenses, sexual aggression, obsessive behavior. Many names surfaced, none held up. The lack of witnesses became another defining feature. No one reported seeing a suspicious figure approaching. No vehicles were identified. No neighbors heard anything unusual. This raised an uncomfortable question. How was the person responsible remaining unseen? From an educational standpoint, this points to a critical factor. The offender likely arrived before the couples, waited, observed, blended into darkness and terrain. Predators often arrive early, victims arrive late. As forensic teams revisited scenes, they identified signs of post-event actions that served no practical purpose. Actions that required time, actions that increased risk of discovery. That detail suggested compulsion layered on top of control. This combination is rare and dangerous. The investigation also faced internal conflict. Different units disagreed on theories. Some believed it was one individual, others suspected multiple people working together. The so-called group theory emerged during this period. It proposed that one person carried out the attacks while others assisted or enabled. This idea would later shape arrests and trials, but at the time, it created division. From a psychological perspective, group-based offending requires trust, shared secrecy, shared motivation. Those dynamics leave traces, yet investigators found no clear social network connecting suspects. Another challenge involved media pressure. Italian newspapers followed every development closely. Speculation became constant. Leaks blurred fact and theory. Investigators found themselves responding to headlines instead of evidence. This is a known risk in high-profile cases. Public narratives can quietly influence investigative decisions. By the mid-1980s, authorities felt cornered. The public demanded results. Political pressure mounted. Careers were at stake. And then a letter arrived. The envelope was addressed to a prosecutor. Inside was a message and a disturbing object linked to one of the cases. It was a direct communication. This changed the psychological profile immediately. Direct contact suggests confidence. It suggests a desire to provoke. It suggests someone who feels untouchable. Experts later identified this as a critical escalation. The sender wasn't hiding anymore. But even then, the trail went cold. No fingerprints matched. No handwriting identification led anywhere. The letter created fear without clarity. Shortly after, the attack stopped. No announcement, no explanation, just silence. This sudden halt raised new questions. Did the person responsible die? Were they incarcerated for something else? Did they feel satisfied? From a behavioral standpoint, sudden cessation can mean several things, none of them reassuring. Investigators turned inward. They focused on known suspects more aggressively. One individual rose to the center of attention. He lived locally. He had a violent past. He fit parts of the behavioral profile. His name would soon dominate headlines. But here's where things became complicated. Evidence against him was largely circumstantial. Statements conflicted. Timelines didn't align cleanly. Physical proof was thin. Still, momentum had shifted. When institutions feel pressure, certainty becomes attractive. From a psychological perspective, this is where tunnel vision often begins. Investigators began interpreting ambiguous details as confirmation. Witness recollections were reshaped by suggestion. Alternative theories lost traction. The case moved toward prosecution. And with that shift, the Monster of Florence transformed from an unknown presence into a specific face. But was it the right one? Experts would later debate this fiercely. Some argued the case had finally been cracked. Others believed the real offender remained free. What mattered most was this. The investigation was no longer searching broadly. It was narrowing. That narrowing would lead to trials, convictions, and international attention. It would also leave lingering doubts that still haunt the case today. Because once the system commits to a narrative, reversing course becomes almost impossible, and in this case, the cost of being wrong was enormous. As the legal process accelerated, one crucial question remained unanswered. Were investigators closing in on the truth, or were they building certainty on unstable ground? The answer would emerge slowly, painfully, and controversially. What happened next would divide Italy and force the world to question whether justice had truly been served. Once the investigation narrowed, everything accelerated. Files that had sat untouched for years were suddenly treated as definitive. Interviews were reframed. Timelines were compressed. The case was no longer open-ended. It was moving toward resolution. The man at the center of this shift was local, known, unsettling. He had a documented history of violence and instability. to many investigators, he looked like the answer they had been waiting for. From a psychological perspective, familiarity can feel like clarity. When fear has no face, assigning one brings relief. That relief can be dangerous. Investigators revisited his past with renewed intensity. Prior conflicts, aggressive behavior, statements from neighbors, everything was pulled forward and placed under a microscope. Some details seemed to fit, others required interpretation. For example, he lived near several attack locations. That proximity was framed as opportunity, but proximity alone does not establish behavior. This distinction mattered. As interviews expanded, witnesses were asked to remember events from years earlier. Memories were reconstructed under pressure. Small inconsistencies were smoothed over. Certainty was encouraged. This is a known cognitive risk. Memory is not a recording, it is a reconstruction. Meanwhile, forensic evidence remained thin. The firearm was still missing. No fingerprints connected him to scenes, no biological traces tied him directly to the attacks. What existed instead were patterns and assumptions. To compensate, investigators leaned heavily on behavioral profiling. From a criminal psychology standpoint, the offender was believed to be male, local, socially isolated, and familiar with firearms. He likely held deep resentment toward intimacy and control. These traits are not rare. That overlap widened the suspect pool rather than narrowing it. Despite this, the narrative hardened. Prosecutors built the case centered on character rather than concrete linkage. Past violence became predictive evidence. Rumors gained weight. Coincidences were elevated. This is where the investigation crossed a critical threshold. It moved from discovery to defense of a theory. As the legal process unfolded, public opinion followed quickly. Headlines simplified complexity. The monster now had a name, a background, a story people could grasp. From a societal perspective, this shift is powerful. Uncertainty creates anxiety. Resolution creates calm, even if the resolution is flawed. At trial, the prosecution argued that the suspect's psychological profile matched the offender perfectly. His past behavior was framed as escalation. His lifestyle was portrayed as secrecy. But defense attorneys raised serious concerns. They highlighted the absence of physical evidence. They challenged witness reliability. They questioned investigative bias. These objections mattered. Experts later noted that profiling can guide investigations, but it cannot replace proof. Profiles describe tendencies, not identities. Despite this, a conviction followed. The relief was immediate. Communities exhaled. Media declared the case closed. Officials spoke of justice served. For a moment it seemed the nightmare was over. But cracks appeared quickly. Appeals exposed weaknesses. Evidence interpretation was challenged. Alternative explanations resurfaced. Then came a turning point. The conviction was overturned. This reversal stunned the public. Confidence collapsed. The case reopened in the court of opinion. From a psychological perspective, reversals are destabilizing. They revive fear and doubt. They force institutions to confront error, and error was now undeniable. Investigators pivoted again. Attention shifted to the idea of accomplices. If one man could not account for everything, perhaps others were involved. This reframing preserved the original narrative while expanding responsibility. The group theory gained traction. Under this theory, multiple individuals shared knowledge, roles, and silence. One might have scouted locations, another might have handled logistics, another might have acted directly. This theory explained inconsistencies. It also introduced new problems. Group-based offending leaves communication trails. Shared secrets fracture. Someone talks. Eventually, someone did. A man with his own criminal history came forward. His testimony implicated himself and others. He described participation. He described rituals, but his statements shifted over time. Details changed. Timelines blurred. Motives evolved. From an educational standpoint, this raises red flags. Confessions that change often reflect external pressure rather than internal truth. Still, his testimony became central. New arrests followed. New trials began. Convictions were secured. Once again, the system declared success, yet many experts remained unconvinced. Independent criminologists questioned why no physical evidence linked the group to all cases. Journalists uncovered inconsistencies. Families voiced doubts. The absence of the firearm loomed larger than ever, because without it, the chain remained incomplete. From a forensic standpoint, a single weapon across decades suggests continuity. That continuity demands direct linkage. It never arrived. As years passed, the case became layered. Legal outcomes stacked atop unresolved questions. Truth blurred beneath process. This is a phenomenon seen in complex investigations. Once momentum builds, stopping feels like failure. so the case moved forward. But the Monster of Florence did not fade. The attacks had stopped, convictions existed, and yet uncertainty persisted. Why did the crimes begin when they did? Why did they stop? Why were the gaps so long? Why were no mistakes made early? These questions haunted experts. From a psychological perspective, long-term offenders usually escalate or deteriorate. They grow careless. They seek recognition. This offender did neither. That contradiction remains one of the case's most unsettling aspects. In later years, advancements in forensic science reopened hope. DNA analysis, improved ballistics, new databases, cold case reviews began quietly. Some evidence was re-examined, some leads were reconsidered. But time had taken its toll. Key items were lost, records were incomplete, witnesses had passed away, the opportunity window had narrowed. What remained was interpretation. Did the convictions represent fragmented truth, or were they institutional closure built on fear? This question still divides experts. What cannot be denied is this: the investigation revealed how systems behave under prolonged pressure, how narratives form, how certainty can replace accuracy, and how once a story hardens, facts struggle to breathe. As the legal dust settled, Italy was left with an uncomfortable reality. The case was officially resolved, but psychologically it was anything but. Because the final piece was still missing. Not a suspect, not a confession, but understanding. Understanding who this person truly was, what drove them, and whether they were ever truly stopped. The final chapter would attempt to answer those questions, not with verdicts, but with insight. By the time the legal process ended, Italy had verdicts, it had convictions, it had explanations that fit inside court transcripts. What it did not have was certainty. And that distinction matters. From a psychological perspective, resolution and understanding are not the same thing. Resolution ends a process. Understanding explains behavior. This case achieved the first without fully achieving the second. Officially, the Monster of Florence investigation concluded with multiple individuals held responsible. Courts ruled, sentences were imposed, files were closed. But among investigators, journalists, and forensic psychologists, doubts persisted. Why? Because the central questions were never fully answered. Why did the attacks follow such a rigid pattern? Why couples? Why secluded locations? Why the same weapon across decades? And why the sudden stop? These are not minor details, they are behavioral anchors. Experts revisiting the case often focus on control over timing, control over location, control over risk. This offender chose moments of maximum vulnerability with minimal exposure. That level of consistency suggests one guiding mind. Group-based theories struggle here. Groups create variability. They introduce error. They require communication. Communication leaves traces. Those traces were never convincingly found. Another unresolved issue involved escalation. Many long-term offenders either increase frequency or intensify behavior. This case did neither predictably. Instead, it showed restraint and patience. That points towards someone with a stable external life, someone capable of blending in, someone whose inner world remained hidden. From a psychological standpoint, this aligns with offenders who compartmentalize. They separate identity. They maintain outward normalcy while sustaining internal fixation. This is one reason the case remains studied today. The convictions, while legally binding, did not eliminate these contradictions. Instead, they layered legal certainty over behavioral ambiguity. Families of those lost were left in an impossible position. Closure offered by courts did not always align with the evidence they had seen. For some, doubt became permanent. This highlights another lesson. Justice systems prioritize finality. Human systems seek truth. Those goals do not always align. Over time, investigators attempted to extract lessons. One major takeaway involved early pattern recognition. The failure to connect cases in the early years allowed the behavior to continue unchecked. This case changed how Italian authorities approached repeat scenarios. Shared databases improved. Interjurisdictional communication expanded. Behavioral analysis gained credibility. In that sense, progress emerged from tragedy. Another lesson involved media influence. Saturation coverage created pressure that shaped investigative choices. Modern protocols now emphasize insulation between media narratives and evidentiary analysis. This shift was not accidental. The Monster of Florence case exposed how easily fear can steer institutions towards certainty rather than accuracy. From a prevention standpoint, experts emphasize situational awareness rather than fear. The attacks exploited isolation and predictability. Understanding that helps shape safer behavior without panic. Education replaced silence. As forensic science advanced, some hoped new technology would reopen answers. DNA analysis, improved ballistic matching, cold case methodologies. But science cannot recover what time erases. Critical evidence had been lost. Scenes were long gone. Witnesses were no longer available. The opportunity for definitive answers narrowed each year. What remained was interpretation, and interpretation depends on perspective. Some believe the convictions represent fragmented truth, pieces of a larger picture that will never be fully assembled. Others believe the system found the closest possible answer given the constraints. Both positions coexist. This duality is why the case endures. It is not remembered only for what happened, but for what remains unknown. From a psychological standpoint, unresolved cases occupy a unique space. They challenge our need for narrative completion. They resist clean endings. They remind us that not all behavior fits models. Not all harm yields clarity. The Monster of Florence case also reshaped how investigators think about silence, the absence of communication, the lack of taunting, the refusal to seek recognition. These traits distinguish certain offenders from those driven by notoriety. This individual, whoever they truly were, did not want attention. They wanted control. That distinction is critical in threat assessment today. As years passed, public fascination shifted toward analysis rather than spectacle. Books, documentaries, and academic studies reframed the case as a cautionary example, not of evil hiding in shadows, but of systems struggling under pressure. This reframing matters, because true crime, when done responsibly, is not about shock. It is about understanding risk, recognizing patterns, and learning how prevention can fail or succeed. The people who lost their lives in this case were more than components of a mystery. They were individuals living ordinary moments, moments that should have been safe. Honoring them means learning from what went wrong. It means acknowledging uncertainty rather than forcing closure. And it means accepting that some questions may never be answered. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a case that officially ended, but psychologically remains open. A case that taught investigators to look earlier, think broader, and resist narrative comfort. A case that reminds us how easily assumptions can delay truth. And a case that still asks one final question. If certainty was achieved too quickly, if doubt was silenced too early, then who was the Monster of Florence really? The answer may never be fully known, but the lessons are. And those lessons continue to shape how investigators, psychologists, and communities understand patterns of harm today. In the end, this case is not defined by a name or a verdict. It is defined by what it revealed about human behavior, institutional pressure, and the cost of missed connections. That understanding, imperfect as it is, may be the closest thing to truth this case will ever give. And sometimes, that has to be enough.